Welcome back to our channel, True Crime Enthusiasts. In 2026, a new series of executions is scheduled across the United States, closing cases that have sat on death row for decades. Some of these crimes happened in the 1980s and 1990s. Others are more recent. Years turned into appeals. Appeals turned into waiting. Now the state is preparing to act. But after so much time, the question remains. Is this justice carried out, or justice delayed beyond recognition? Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch closely. This is not just about punishment. It is about what finally happens when the waiting ends. James Garfield Broadnax Estate, Texas, age 38, execution date April 30, 2026. James Garfield Broadnax was born in 1988 in Texas and grew up in Dallas, a city where street alliances often formed early and consequences arrived fast. By his late teens, Broadnax had aligned himself with a local gang, moving through neighborhoods where robbery was routine and firearms were not a threat but a tool. In 2008, he was 19 years old, already embedded in a cycle of street violence that would culminate in a double homicide. In June of that year, Broadnax and an accomplice targeted a music garage in Dallas, a space used by producers Stephen Swan and Matthew Butler. The location was informal, familiar, and unguarded. According to trial records, the intent was robbery. The escalation was immediate. Inside the garage, Broadnax produced a .380 caliber handgun. Both Swan and Butler were shot and killed at close range. There was no prolonged struggle, no warning. The crime was fast, direct, and fatal. Two men were left dead on the floor of a place meant for work and creativity, not violence. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Witness statements placed Broadnax at the scene, and physical evidence tied him to the weapon used in the shootings. He was arrested shortly after the murders. During questioning, investigators focused on the sequence of events inside the garage, establishing that Broadnax was the primary shooter. The case moved rapidly through the system, driven by the clarity of the evidence and the severity of the crime. In 2009, Broadnax was tried in a Texas criminal court. The proceedings were marked by controversy, particularly claims that black jurors had been improperly excluded during jury selection. Defense attorneys argued that this compromised the fairness of the trial. Prosecutors countered that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and that the jury's composition did not alter the facts of the case. The jury ultimately convicted Broadnax of capital murder, a charge reserved for the most serious homicides under Texas law. Sentenced to death, Broadnax entered the long phase of appeals that defines death row in the United States. His legal team challenged the conviction and sentence through state and federal courts, raising issues related to jury selection and constitutional protections. Each appeal was denied. Over the years, the facts of the crime remained unchanged in court rulings. As it stands, James Garfield Broadnax is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on April 30, 2026 in Texas. He was 19 when he killed two men during a robbery. He will be in his late 30s when the sentence is carried out. Christa Pike, State, Tennessee, age 50, execution date September 30, 2026. Christa Pike was born in 1976 in West Virginia, into a childhood defined by instability. Family violence, neglect, and abuse shaped her early years, followed by repeated encounters with the mental health system. By her late teens, Pike had been enrolled in the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee, a federally funded effort meant to provide structure, training, and distance from troubled pasts. Instead, it became the setting for a fixation that would end in murder. At Job Corps, Pike became convinced that another student, 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, was trying to take her boyfriend. The belief was not supported by evidence, but it hardened quickly. According to later testimony, Pike spoke openly about her anger, rehearsing threats and building resentment. The conflict did not remain verbal. On January 12, 1995, Pike, her boyfriend Tadarrell Shipp, and their friend Shadolla Peterson convinced Slemmer to leave campus with them under the pretense of smoking marijuana. They drove to a secluded area near the University of Tennessee. Once there, the situation shifted. Over the next 30 minutes, Slemmer was beaten and tortured. She was punched and kicked. Her skin was cut with a box cutter. Pike carved a pentagram into Slemmer's chest. The assault continued until Pike picked up a chunk of asphalt and struck Slemmer repeatedly in the head. When it was over, Slemmer was dead. Pike broke off a piece of the victim's skull and kept it. 2 days later, on January 14, Pike showed the skull fragment to other students back at Job Corps. That act triggered the investigation. Authorities were notified, and Pike was arrested. During questioning, she confessed. Peterson also gave statements, eventually agreeing to testify for the prosecution. The crime scene was located, and physical evidence matched the accounts given by those involved. Pike's trial took place in 1996 in Tennessee. Prosecutors presented the killing as a deliberate act driven by jealousy and control, with Pike as the clear leader. Peterson testified in detail about Pike's role in directing the attack. The defense emphasized Pike's history of abuse and mental illness, arguing diminished responsibility. The jury rejected that argument. Pike was convicted of first-degree murder with aggravating factors of torture and premeditation. She was sentenced to death, with an additional 25 years for conspiracy. Over the next 2 decades, Pike filed multiple appeals, focusing on her mental health, her age at the time of the crime, and claims of ineffective legal representation. Each appeal was denied, including at the federal level in 2019. Christa Gale Pike is scheduled to be executed by electric chair on September 30, 2026. If carried out, it will mark the first execution of a woman in Tennessee in more than 200 years. Charles Victor Thompson's age 56, execution date January 28, 2026. Charles Victor Thompson was the sole perpetrator in the crime, acting alone and pulling the trigger himself, driven by personal resentment rather than robbery or gang loyalty. Born in 1970 in Texas, Thompson had a long history of volatile arguments with his former girlfriend, Denise Hayslip. Friends and witnesses later described the relationship as unstable, marked by jealousy, control, and repeated confrontations that never fully cooled down after the breakup. On April 30, 1998, that tension reached its breaking point. After another dispute, Thompson went to Hayslip's apartment in Harris County. Inside, he found her with her new boyfriend, Darren Kane. What followed unfolded in seconds. Thompson produced a firearm and shot Kane 4 times, striking his neck and chest. Kane collapsed at the scene and died from his injuries. Thompson then turned the gun on Hayslip, firing a single shot into her face. The bullet caused catastrophic damage, but she did not die immediately. Hayslip was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. For a brief period, she remained alive, though unresponsive. Doctors later determined that her injuries were unsurvivable. After consultation with family, the decision was made to remove her breathing tube. She died shortly after. Prosecutors would later argue that Thompson's actions directly caused her death, regardless of the medical decision that followed. Thompson did not attempt to disappear. The next morning, he turned himself in to police. He also admitted what he had done to acquaintances, making statements that were later introduced at trial. In 1999, he was tried in Texas for capital murder. A central issue during the proceedings was the cause of Hayslip's death, with the defense arguing that the removal of life support broke the chain of causation. The jury rejected that argument, finding Thompson criminally responsible for both killings. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Years later, his case returned to court after an appeal focused on sentencing issues. In 2005, a new punishment hearing was ordered. During that phase, prosecutors introduced additional evidence showing that Thompson had attempted to arrange the murder of a key witness while incarcerated. The jury again imposed the death penalty. Thompson continued to pursue appeals through state and federal courts, raising constitutional and procedural challenges. Each effort failed. Courts consistently ruled that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and that the sentence was lawfully imposed. Charles Victor Thompson remains on death row in Texas. His execution by lethal injection is scheduled for January 28, 2026. The crime that put him there began with a personal grievance and ended with 2 people dead inside an apartment, leaving no question about who fired the shots. Cedric Allen Ricks, State, Texas, AG 51, execution date March 11, 2026. Cedric Allen Ricks was the direct perpetrator in the crime, the person who carried out the stabbings himself. He killed Roxanne Sanchez, his romantic partner, and her 8-year-old son. The sole survivor was her 12-year-old son, who sustained severe injuries but lived. Ricks was born in 1975 and was living in Tarrant County, Texas, at the time of the crime. He had been in a relationship with Roxanne Sanchez, a mother of 2 boys. Neighbors and later testimony described the relationship as strained, with arguments that had become more frequent. By May of 2013, tensions inside the household had reached a point where conflict no longer stayed verbal. On May 1, 2013, an argument broke out inside the home. What triggered it was never fully clarified, but the escalation was immediate. Ricks armed himself with a knife and attacked Sanchez first. She was stabbed repeatedly in the neck and upper body. The attack did not stop there. Ricks then turned on her children. The 12-year-old was stabbed in the neck, chest, face, and hands while trying to defend himself. The 8-year-old was also stabbed multiple times. The wounds were deep and extensive. Sanchez and her younger son died from their injuries at the scene. The older boy survived, badly injured, after managing to escape and get help. After the stabbings, Ricks fled. He took Sanchez's vehicle and left the state. During his flight, he made phone calls to family members and admitted what he had done. Those calls would later become part of the evidence against him. Law enforcement tracked him across state lines, and he was arrested in Garvin County, Oklahoma, without incident. Ricks was returned to Texas to stand trial. Prosecutors charged him with capital murder, citing the killing of a child during the same criminal episode. The case did not involve competing suspects or complex forensic disputes. The physical evidence, the surviving victim's testimony, and Ricks's own admissions formed the core of the prosecution's case. The defense did not present evidence of another attacker or claim mistaken identity. The jury convicted Ricks of capital murder. During sentencing, the prosecution emphasized the brutality of the attack and the fact that the victims were attacked in their own home. The defense raised mitigation arguments, but did not dispute responsibility. The jury returned a sentence of death. Cedric Allen Ricks is currently on death row in Texas. His execution by lethal injection is scheduled for March 11, 2026. The crime that put him there lasted only minutes, but it destroyed a family and left one child alive with permanent physical and psychological scars. Kendrick Antonio Simpson, State, Oklahoma, age 44, execution date February 12, 2026. Kendrick Antonio Simpson acted with prior malice, deliberately shooting and killing 2 men in a single course of violence. The victims were Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones. Prosecutors would later argue that Simpson did not fire in panic or self-defense, but with intent formed before the trigger was pulled. Simpson was born in 1982 and later became one of the many people displaced by Hurricane Katrina. After the storm, he relocated to Oklahoma City, carrying with him a history of mental health problems that had gone largely untreated. Records and testimony would later describe instability, paranoia, and difficulty functioning in everyday life. By 2006, Simpson was living on the margins, struggling to maintain housing and relationships, and frequently involved in confrontations with others. The killings occurred in 2006 in Oklahoma City. Details presented at trial showed that a dispute broke out involving Simpson, Palmer, and Jones. What began as an argument did not stay verbal. Simpson produced a firearm and opened fire, shooting both men. Glenn Palmer was struck and killed. Anthony Jones was also shot and died from his injuries. The shootings were close in time and location, forming a single violent episode rather than separate, unrelated acts. Police responded to the scene and began an investigation that quickly centered on Simpson. Witness accounts, combined with physical evidence, placed him at the center of the shootings. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. From the beginning, the case raised questions about his mental state, both at the time of the crime and during the legal process that followed. At trial in Oklahoma, prosecutors focused on intent. They argued that Simpson knew what he was doing and chose to use deadly force. The defense emphasized his mental illness, pointing to his history as a Katrina evacuee who had spiraled without adequate care or supervision. Despite that context, the jury concluded that Simpson was legally responsible for his actions. He was convicted on both counts of first-degree murder. During sentencing, the prosecution highlighted the loss of 2 lives and the irreversible nature of Simpson's actions. The defense again raised mental health as mitigation, arguing for life imprisonment instead of death. The jury rejected that request and imposed 2 death sentences. Simpson's appeals centered largely on his mental health and on Oklahoma's execution procedures. His attorneys argued that his psychological condition should bar execution, and that the state's method of carrying out the death penalty was unconstitutional. Courts at both the state and federal level denied those claims, ruling that Simpson was competent under the law and that the sentence stood. Kendrick Antonio Simpson remains on death row in Oklahoma. He is scheduled to be executed on February 12, 2026. The case stands as one shaped by displacement, mental illness, and a dispute that ended with 2 men dead and no path back from the moment the shots were fired. Edward Lee Busby Jr.'s estate, Texas, age 54, execution date May 14, 26. Edward Lee Busby Jr. was involved in a kidnapping that ended in the death of an elderly victim. The woman he targeted was Laura Lee Crane, a 78-year-old retired professor. She was alone, vulnerable, and running routine errands. Busby was born in 1972 and had a documented criminal history by the time of the offense. In early 2004, he was living in Tarrant County, Texas, moving through Fort Worth with an associate known by the nickname Kitty. The two were looking for an easy target. Laura Lee Crane fit that profile. She had just finished shopping and was in the parking lot of a Fort Worth grocery store on January 30, 2004, when she was approached. Investigators determined that Busby and his accomplice forced Crane into her own vehicle. The kidnapping happened in public, in daylight, without witnesses immediately intervening. Once inside the car, Crane was robbed. To keep her from calling for help or drawing attention, Busby restrained her. Duct tape was placed over her mouth and nose. The restraint was not momentary. Crane struggled to breathe. The tape blocked her airway, and she suffocated. She died during the course of the kidnapping. After the killing, Busby and his accomplice abandoned Crane. Her death was later ruled a homicide caused by asphyxiation. The medical findings were consistent with obstruction of the airway rather than natural causes or accidental injury. What began as a robbery escalated into a fatal act through restraint and disregard. Law enforcement launched an investigation that traced Crane's movements from the grocery store parking lot. Surveillance, witness accounts, and forensic evidence led detectives to Busby. He was arrested and charged with capital murder, based on the killing occurring during the commission of a kidnapping. The accomplice was also charged separately. Busby's trial took place in 2005 in Texas. Prosecutors laid out a straightforward narrative: a deliberate kidnapping, a robbery, and a method of restraint that caused death. The state argued that Busby knew taping an elderly woman's mouth and nose carried a high risk of death. The defense challenged aspects of intent, but did not dispute Busby's involvement. The jury found him guilty of capital murder. During sentencing, the prosecution emphasized the victim's age and the circumstances of her death. Laura Lee Crane was not attacked in a moment of rage. She was restrained and left unable to breathe. The jury returned a sentence of death. Busby pursued appeals through the Texas courts and into the federal system. Those challenges were unsuccessful. Courts upheld the conviction and the sentence, finding no reversible error. Edward Lee Busby, Jr. remains on death row in Texas. His execution by lethal injection is scheduled for May 14, 2026. The crime that placed him there began in a grocery store parking lot and ended with the death of a 78-year-old woman who never had a chance to defend herself. Tony Carruthers, State, Tennessee, age 63, execution date May 21, 2026. Tony Von Carruthers, also known as Tony Von Carruthers or Tony Carruthers, was the primary perpetrator in a triple homicide carried out alongside his brother. Together, they robbed and killed 3 victims: Marcellos Anderson, age 21, Frederick Tucker, age 17, and Deloise Anderson, Marcellos's mother. The murders were not impulsive. Carruthers was born in 1963 and operated in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was connected to local drug activity. By the early 1990s, he and his brother James Montgomery were involved in disputes tied to money and narcotics. In 1994, those disputes converged on the Anderson family. According to trial evidence, Carruthers and Montgomery targeted Marcellos Anderson and Frederick Tucker during a robbery connected to drug dealings. Deloise Anderson became a victim because she was present and posed a risk of identification. The 3 victims were abducted and taken to a remote burial site. Evidence presented at trial showed that they were beaten and restrained. They were then placed into a grave and covered with dirt. Medical testimony indicated that at least some of the victims were still alive when they were buried. Death came not from gunshot wounds or immediate trauma, but from suffocation under the weight of the soil. Prosecutors emphasized that the act of burial was intentional, slow, and final. The crime remained unresolved until the bodies were discovered. Once the remains were found, investigators traced the killings back to Carruthers and his brother. Both men were arrested and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. The case moved to trial in Tennessee in 1996 and quickly became controversial. Carruthers chose to represent himself in court, a decision that drew criticism and later legal scrutiny. His self-representation led to erratic courtroom behavior and procedural disputes, but the trial continued. Prosecutors presented physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic findings that tied Carruthers directly to the planning and execution of the murders. The jury convicted him on all counts and returned 3 death sentences. His brother James Montgomery, tried separately, was later acquitted. That outcome became a focal point of Carruthers' appeals, with arguments centered on inconsistent verdicts and fairness. Courts repeatedly rejected those claims, ruling that the evidence against Carruthers was distinct and overwhelming. Over the years, Carruthers pursued multiple appeals through state and federal courts, challenging his conviction, his self-representation, and the proportionality of his sentence. Each challenge failed. The convictions and death sentences were upheld. Tony Von Carruthers remains on death row in Tennessee. His execution is scheduled for May 21, 2026. The case stands out not only for the number of victims, but for the method of killing, where burial itself became the weapon, leaving 3 people to die beneath the ground. Gerald R. Hand, State, Ohio, age 77, execution date June 17, 26. Gerald R. Hand planned and carried out the killing of his wife for financial gain, then murdered his accomplice to erase the trail. The primary victim was Jill Hand, his 4th wife. The second was Lonnie Welch, the friend he recruited to stage the crime as a burglary. Prosecutors would later frame the case as a calculated sequence: profit first, silence second. Hand was born in 1949 in Ohio, and by middle age his life showed a disturbing pattern. His first wife, Donna, died in 1976. His second wife, Lori, died in 1979. Both deaths raised suspicions years later when investigators noticed insurance payouts and inconsistencies, though no charges were filed at the time. By 2002, Hand was married again, this time to Jill Hand, and financial pressure had returned. Life insurance became the motive that tied the past to the present. In 2002, Hand approached Lonnie Welch with a plan. Welch was to pose as an intruder and kill Jill inside the couple's home in Delaware County, Ohio. The staging was meant to look like a home invasion gone wrong. On the day of the murder, Jill Hand was shot and killed in her own house. The scene initially appeared chaotic, but investigators noted details that did not align with a random break-in. The violence was targeted. Nothing of value was taken. After Jill's death, Hand moved quickly. Instead of distancing himself from the crime, he arranged a second killing. Welch, who knew the truth, became a liability. Hand shot and killed him, eliminating the only person who could directly connect him to the plot. Prosecutors later described this second murder as proof of intent, not panic. The goal was control. The investigation unraveled the scheme. Detectives traced communications, financial records, and inconsistencies in Hand's statements. Welch's death raised immediate red flags, prompting a deeper look into Hand's history. The earlier deaths of Donna and Lori resurfaced, establishing a pattern of spouses dying under suspicious circumstances, followed by financial benefit. Hand was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. At trial in 2003, prosecutors laid out the timeline step by step. They argued that Jill Hand's murder was not an act of rage or desperation, but a transaction. Welch's killing, they said, was a cleanup operation. The defense challenged the credibility of witnesses and downplayed the significance of the prior deaths, but the jury was unconvinced. Hand was convicted and sentenced to death. His appeals focused on evidentiary issues and sentencing procedure, but state and federal courts upheld the verdict. Judges consistently ruled that the planning, the financial motive, and the execution-style killings justified the sentence. Gerald R. Hand remains on Ohio's death row. His execution is scheduled for June 17, 2026. The case stands out not for sudden violence, but for its structure. A series of decisions made over years, with marriage, money, and murder repeating the same pattern, until it ended in a death sentence. Cleveland Raymond Jackson, State, Ohio, age 48, execution date July 15, 2026. Cleveland Raymond Jackson was one of 2 perpetrators in an armed robbery that ended with the shooting deaths of 2 victims, one of them a child. Jackson acted alongside his brother, Gerald Cunningham. The victims were 3-year-old Jalla Grant and 17-year-old Lanesha Williams. Jackson was born in 1978 in Ohio and grew up in an environment marked by instability and exposure to crime. By adulthood, He and his brother were involved in armed robberies. On January 3, 2002, they targeted a residence in Lima, Ohio. The house was occupied, but that did not deter them. They entered armed, expecting to take money or valuables. What followed unfolded inside a confined domestic space, with victims trapped and nowhere to run. During the robbery, gunfire erupted. Lanesha Williams, a 17-year-old girl inside the home, was shot and killed. In the chaos, 3-year-old Jala Grant was also struck by gunfire. The child died from her wounds. Investigators emphasized that neither victim was armed and neither posed any resistance. The presence of a toddler did not stop the shooting. The robbery ended with 2 people dead and a crime scene that shocked even seasoned investigators. Police launched an intensive investigation. Witness statements, forensic evidence, and information gathered from the community led authorities to Cleveland Raymond Jackson and Jeronique Cunningham. Both were arrested and charged with aggravated murder. The killings of a child and a teenager during an armed robbery elevated the case to one of the most serious prosecutions under Ohio law. At trial, prosecutors laid out the sequence of events and focused on Jackson's active participation. They argued that he knowingly took part in an armed invasion where the risk of death was obvious and accepted. The defense raised arguments related to Jackson's mental health, suggesting impairment and reduced culpability. Those claims were examined but ultimately rejected by the court. The jury found that the evidence supported full criminal responsibility. Jackson was convicted and sentenced to death. The sentence reflected not only the number of victims, but their ages. The killing of a 3-year-old child became a central factor in the jury's decision. Cunningham received a separate sentence in his own proceedings, but Jackson's punishment stood on its own facts and findings. Over the years, Jackson pursued appeals through the Ohio courts, arguing that mental health issues should mitigate his sentence and that errors occurred during trial. Each appeal was denied. Courts consistently ruled that the convictions were supported by strong evidence and that the death sentence was legally imposed. Cleveland Raymond Jackson remains on death row in Ohio. His execution is scheduled for July 15, 2026. The crime that placed him there lasted only minutes, but it ended 2 lives, including one that had barely begun, and left a permanent mark on the community where it happened. By the time these executions take place, many families have waited longer than a generation for an outcome. Some victims are remembered only in court records. Some defendants have spent most of their lives behind bars. In 2026, the system reaches its final step. Whether that step brings closure or raises new questions is left to the viewer. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Justice, once delayed this long, does not speak for itself.